They tell you America is a land of fresh starts, of reinvention, of people who cut their past loose and walk forward clean. But there are places where the past never loosened its grip, places where blood remembered everything. Tonight, you're not here to be entertained. You're here because something in you wanted to know what happens when a family never escapes itself. What happens when a name becomes a cage? And what happens when a child is born already condemned by choices made long before breath ever filled their lungs? And there are no photographs at the beginning, no records proudly displayed, just whispers, census gaps, birth certificates that repeat the same surnames too often, marriage licenses that look like printing errors until you realize they are not errors at all. They are patterns that stretch across decades in the same hollows, the same dirt roads, the same sagging houses where nothing ever truly left and nothing new ever came in. And this story doesn't start with monsters. It starts with isolation, a pocket of land cut off by geography and suspicion, a place where outsiders were noticed immediately and welcomed never, where families learned that survival meant turning inward, trusting only those who shared your blood, because blood was the only thing you believed couldn't betray you. Over time, that belief hardened into law, not written, not spoken aloud, just understood, and the first generation told themselves it was temporary. That once things improved, once roads were built and money came and opportunities arrived, the walls would come down, but opportunity never arrived, and the walls only grew thicker. Children grew up seeing the same faces reflected back at them, year after year, until familiarity replaced normality. The strange became ordinary. The unthinkable became routine, and by the second generation, questions were discouraged. By the third, they were dangerous. Family history wasn't taught, it was edited. Stories ended early, names were skipped, and whenever a child asked why everyone looked so similar, the answer was always the same. This is just how we are. And what no one said was how the body remembers what the mind refuses to face. How errors begin quietly. A limp dismissed as clumsiness. Speech delays blamed on shyness. Eyes that don't track quite right. Emotions that don't sit where they should. Rage without cause. Silence without comfort. Doctors were avoided. Schools were mistrusted. The outside world was considered a threat, not a lifeline. And so the family closed ranks tighter. Weddings became smaller. Births happened at home. Records stayed thin. The same surnames circled back on themselves until the family tree stopped branching and began folding inward, like a mirror facing itself. And by the fourth generation, the nightmare was no longer invisible. Children were born already struggling, already different, already marked. Some never learned to speak. Some never learned fear. Others learned it too well. And still nothing changed. Because changing would mean admitting what had been done. And admitting it would mean facing guilt too heavy to carry. And this is where the myth of American freedom breaks, because freedom requires choice, and choice requires awareness. In this family, neither survived. Young people were taught who they would marry before they were taught who they were. Love was not a feeling. It was an obligation. Bloodlines were protected not out of pride, but out of terror. Terror of outsiders, terror of judgment, terror that the truth, once seen, could never be unseen, and neighbors noticed. Social workers came and went. But every visit ended the same way. Smiles, closed doors, silence. The family knew how to wait out concern. They had been waiting out consequences for generations, and what grew inside those walls was not just genetic damage, it was psychological rot. Children raised without reference points, without mirrors that showed them who they could have been, only who they were allowed to be. Affection was inconsistent. Discipline was harsh, and trauma recycled itself like an heirloom, passed down with the same inevitability as eye color or bone structure. And by the time the outside world truly looked closely, it was already too late to undo anything. You can't reverse generations of isolation. You can't separate identity from damage when they've grown together for a century. You can only document, observe, and ask the question no one in that family was ever allowed to ask. And what if someone had stopped it early? And because every nightmare like this begins the same way, not with cruelty, but with fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of the outside. Fear that safety only exists inside familiar blood, and once that fear takes root, it doesn't just shape families, it traps them. And this was only the beginning, and by the time the fifth generation was born, the land itself seemed complicit. The houses leaned inward as if listening. Floorboards remembered footsteps that never left. Even the air felt stale, recycled through the same lungs decade after decade. Children grew up surrounded by echoes instead of futures. Every adult they knew was related to them in more ways than one, and no one ever explained why that mattered. And records from this period are fragmented, but what survives is unsettling. Birth weights far below average, infant mortality that quietly doubled neighboring counties, school reports describing children who couldn't focus, couldn't read faces, couldn't regulate emotion. The language is careful, bureaucratic, but beneath it sits alarm, restrained by politeness and disbelief, because people don't want to believe this happens in America. Not like this, not for this long, and the family elders had developed a system. Outsiders were answered with charm or hostility, whichever worked faster. If a teacher asked too many questions, the child was pulled from school. If a doctor pushed for testing, appointments were missed. The family didn't deny there were problems. They reframed them. God's will, bad luck, a streak of illness that would pass. Anything but the truth, and inside the home, the children learned early what not to say. They learned which topics caused tension, which words made adults go quiet. They learned that curiosity was dangerous, that silence was safer than understanding. When one child began asking why his cousins looked exactly like his siblings, the question stopped after a single conversation behind a closed door. No one ever heard him ask again, and as the years passed, the symptoms became harder to hide. Some children never developed the ability to feel empathy. Others felt it too intensely, crushed by emotions they couldn't name. Violence appeared suddenly, without warning, like a storm breaking through clear skies. Animals were hurt, objects were destroyed. Apologies were never required, because nothing was ever acknowledged. And what grows in an environment like this is not just dysfunction, it's distortion. The sense of what is normal bends until harm becomes routine, until pain becomes background noise, until children grow into adults who cannot recognize that anything is wrong, because wrong has always been home, and marriage within the family was no longer even discussed. It was assumed. Introductions weren't necessary. There were no choices to weigh. The pool was small, and everyone knew exactly who would end up with whom. Love was something seen on television, not something expected in real life. What mattered was continuity, preservation, keeping everything contained. And one woman later interviewed in fragments by a social worker described it as being born into a hallway with no doors. You could walk forward, you could walk back, but you could never leave. She said she knew, even as a child, that something was broken. She just didn't know it had a name, and as medical knowledge advanced outside their world, the gap widened. Genetic counseling became common elsewhere. Early intervention saved lives elsewhere. But inside this family, science was viewed with suspicion. Testing was an accusation. Diagnosis was a threat. To accept either would mean admitting responsibility, and responsibility would unravel everything they had convinced themselves was necessary, and children who should have received care were instead hidden, kept out of sight, sometimes kept out of daylight. Not because the family hated them, but because they didn't know what else to do. Shame mixed with loyalty until neither could be separated. And in that mixture, cruelty found room to breathe. And there are moments documented in brief notes and offhand comments where escape almost happened. A teacher who tried harder than the rest. A neighbor who called authorities one more time. A young adult who spoke of leaving town. Every time the family closed ranks, pressure was applied, guilt was weaponized, blood was invoked, and the moment passed. And this is the part of the story where people ask why no one intervened sooner, why the system failed, why the warning signs were ignored. But the truth is quieter and more uncomfortable. The system did notice. It just didn't want to look too closely, because looking closely would mean admitting that some horrors don't come from strangers or criminals. They come from families, slowly, patiently, in plain sight. And by now, the nightmare was fully alive. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just constant. A low hum of suffering woven into daily life, children born into bodies already carrying the weight of generations, adults trapped in roles they never chose, and a family history so entangled that no one could tell where tradition ended and damage began. And then still, the worst was yet to come, and by the sixth generation, the family no longer needed isolation to sustain the nightmare. It lived inside them now. Even if the roads had opened, even if help had arrived at the door and stayed, the damage had already settled into muscle memory and instinct. This is what happens when survival strategies outlive the danger they were meant to protect against. They become prisons, and those born during this period were different in ways that could no longer be explained away. Developmental delays were severe. Physical abnormalities appeared with unsettling regularity. Some children aged without maturing, trapped in bodies that grew while their minds stayed behind. Others developed obsessions that ruled their lives, repeating the same actions for hours, days, sometimes years. The family didn't have language for any of it. They only had explanations that kept them from looking inward, and daily life followed strict routines. Meals at the same times, silence during certain hours, emotional displays discouraged unless they were anger. Anger was understood. Anger had a place. Fear and sadness did not. Children learned quickly that expressing vulnerability brought consequences, while aggression brought relief. So aggression became the default language. And what's rarely discussed in stories like this is how loneliness functions inside a crowded house. How you can be surrounded by people who share your face, your blood, your last name, and still feel completely unseen. These children had no peers who weren't also relatives, no teachers who stayed long enough to notice patterns, no adults who modeled healthy connection. Their world was closed, repetitive, and emotionally starved. And one former caseworker later described visiting the home and feeling disoriented, not because of what she saw, but because of what she didn't. No family photos on the walls, no drawings from children, no evidence of time passing, just furniture, worn smooth by years of use, and people who moved through rooms like ghosts repeating old habits. And by this point, the family history had been rewritten so many times that no one remembered the original truth. Elders spoke in half-myths, stories changed depending on who was listening, responsibility dissolved into inevitability. This is just how things turned out, as if generations of decisions were acts of weather rather than choice. And yet, cracks began to form. Younger members sensed the difference between their lives and what they glimpsed on television, in town, in brief encounters with outsiders. They noticed how other families laughed differently, how children spoke freely, how people left home and came back changed, not punished. That awareness brought something dangerous into the house: comparison. And comparison is lethal to systems built on control. Once you see an alternative, the old rules start to feel less like protection and more like captivity. For a brief moment, rebellion flickered. A teenager ran away and was brought back. Another threatened to talk and was silenced with fear. The message was clear. Leaving was betrayal. Speaking was unforgivable. And this is where the psychological horror deepens. Because by now, many family members were both victims and enforcers. They had suffered under the same system they now defended. Not because they believed in it, but because imagining a world beyond it was too painful. To admit the truth would mean admitting their entire life had been unnecessary suffering. And that realization can break a person. And so denial hardened, control intensified. The family became more suspicious, more aggressive, more closed. And with each generation, the margin for deviation narrowed further. Children who didn't conform were corrected. Children who couldn't conform were hidden. Love, when it appeared at all, was conditional and brittle. And medical professionals who later reviewed the limited data described a textbook case of compounded genetic collapse. But textbooks don't capture what it feels like to grow up knowing something is wrong with you and being told over and over that it's normal. They don't capture the confusion of wanting help but not knowing how to ask, or the terror of realizing that help might destroy the only world you've ever known. And by now, the family was no longer just damaged, it was fragile. One push could shatter it, and that push was coming, whether anyone inside was ready or not. Because secrets like this don't stay buried forever. They surface, they leak. They demand witnesses, and then when the truth finally began to emerge, it didn't arrive gently. And the exposure didn't begin with a headline. It never does. It began with a routine visit that didn't go as planned. A new caseworker, younger, less willing to accept rehearsed answers. Someone who noticed that the ages didn't line up, that the explanations contradicted each other, that the same last names appeared too often in records that were supposed to represent different households. And this time, the door didn't close fast enough, and what was seen wasn't a single shocking moment. It was accumulation. Children who flinched at sudden movement, adults who spoke for them before they could answer, medical histories that ended abruptly years ago, rooms that had been converted into sleeping spaces without regard for age or privacy, and above all, a feeling, the unmistakable sense that something here had been decaying quietly for a very long time, and the family responded the way it always had, with unity, with anger, with accusations of persecution. They insisted the outside world was exaggerating, misunderstanding, imposing its values on people who just wanted to be left alone. And for a moment, that argument almost worked. Because America has a long history of confusing neglect with privacy, of mistaking isolation for independence. But this time there were photographs, medical referrals, school reports that had been buried and resurfaced, patterns that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The same conditions repeating. The same impairments emerging in children born decades apart. The same names appearing on both sides of marriage certificates over and over again. And when authorities finally intervened in force, the reaction inside the family was not relief. It was panic. Because intervention didn't just threaten their lifestyle. It threatened their identity. Everything they knew, everything they had been taught to defend, was suddenly being called what it was: harm. And some members resisted openly. Others shut down completely. Children were removed from homes that had never felt like homes. Adults were questioned, evaluated, documented. And for the first time, the family was forced to sit with professionals who named things out loud. Genetic collapse, Intergenerational trauma, systemic abuse, words that landed like blows because they couldn't be argued away, and what's rarely shown in documentaries is what happens after the cameras leave. The silence that follows exposure, the confusion of children placed in foster homes who don't know how to exist without constant surveillance, the adults who are left behind, stripped of control but not given understanding, the guilt that creeps in slowly, once denial is no longer an option, and some family members broke under questioning, not because they were cruel, but because they were exhausted, tired of carrying a secret they had never chosen, tired of pretending they didn't see what was happening. One man admitted he had always known something was wrong, but didn't believe escape was possible. He said the family felt like gravity. You don't fight gravity. You endure it, and medical examinations confirmed what many had suspected and feared. The genetic damage was extensive and irreversible. Conditions that could have been mitigated generations ago had compounded into permanent disability. There was no cure, only management, only support that had come far too late, and public reaction was swift and predictable. Shock, outrage, disbelief. The story was framed as an anomaly, a freak case, something safely distant from normal life. But the professionals involved knew better. They knew this wasn't an isolated horror. It was an extreme example of something quieter and more common. What happens when fear overrides responsibility? When loyalty is used to excuse harm? When families close ranks instead of opening doors? And for the children removed from the family, the outside world was overwhelming, too loud, too fast, too full of choice. Some adapted slowly, some never did. Trauma doesn't dissolve just because circumstances change. It lingers, it reshapes. And for many of them, the damage had been written into both mind and body before they ever had a chance. And the family itself fractured. Some members cut ties completely. Others clung harder to the old narratives, insisting the intervention had destroyed them, not saved anyone. Lawsuits were threatened. Appeals were filed. But the archive was already open. The secret was no longer theirs to control. And this is the moment where the story stops being about one family and starts becoming about the rest of us. About how long we're willing to look away. About how many warning signs we ignore because confronting them would force us to question our own definitions of normal, private, and acceptable. And because buried beneath this nightmare isn't just a genetic tragedy. It's a moral one, a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it smiles, sometimes it calls itself family. And after the intervention, time didn't heal the damage, it exposed it. Once the family was no longer sealed off, every crack widened under the weight of daylight. People assume that rescue is a clean moment, that once authorities step in, the story pivots toward recovery. But recovery requires something this family had never been given, a sense of self separate from blood. And for those removed as children, the world beyond the family felt unreal. Grocery stores with endless choices, classrooms where no one shared their face, adults who asked questions and waited for answers. Freedom, when it finally arrived, felt less like relief and more like vertigo. Many didn't know how to choose clothing, food, or even when to speak. They had been trained to follow, not decide, and some tried to build new lives. They learned routines slowly, painfully, step by step. Therapists described progress measured in inches, not miles. A child learning to make eye contact, an adult learning to name an emotion without fear. But for others, the damage was too deep. Institutions replaced family homes. Care replaced control. Safety replaced familiarity. And even then, nightmares followed them into sleep. And what haunted professionals most wasn't just the genetic data. It was the psychological inheritance, a learned helplessness passed down as faithfully as bone structure. Many struggled with an unshakable belief that they were fundamentally wrong, that something about them made harm inevitable. When you're told for generations that this is all you are, it takes extraordinary strength to imagine otherwise. And meanwhile, public fascination grew. True crime forums dissected the case. Commentators speculated. Armchair experts debated blame. Was it ignorance or malice, culture or cruelty? But those questions missed the point, because the family wasn't a mystery to solve. It was a warning to understand, and the truth is, no one wakes up one day and decides to destroy their descendants. It happens gradually. A small compromise here, a justified exception there, fear dressed up as protection, loyalty twisted into obligation. Over time, the line between care and control erodes until it disappears entirely, and some former family members spoke anonymously years later. Their voices were flat, measured, as if emotion had been rationed early in life. One said the hardest part wasn't the abuse or the neglect. It was realizing that love had been conditional on obedience, that affection was a reward, not a right. That leaving didn't just mean escape, it meant exile, and others never spoke at all. They returned to the same land, the same houses, even after intervention. Not because they believed in the old ways, but because they didn't know who they were without them. Trauma doesn't always push people away from harm. Sometimes it anchors them to it. And this is where the story becomes uncomfortable for the listener, because it forces a question that doesn't stay confined to this family or this place. How many traditions do we defend simply because they are old? How many harmful patterns survive because challenging them feels like betrayal? How often do we confuse endurance with strength? And if you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? And that question isn't hypothetical. It's the question every member of this family faced, consciously or not. Do you protect the system that raised you, or do you risk everything to stop it? There is no painless answer, only consequences, and what remains today are records, assessments, and lives forever altered. The land still exists, the houses still stand, but the silence that once protected the family has been replaced by something heavier, knowledge. And knowledge, unlike secrecy, does not fade quietly, and this story resists closure because there is none. No ending that feels just, no punishment that restores what was lost, only an understanding carved slowly from horror. That isolation is not neutral, that secrecy is not harmless, and that blood, when treated as destiny instead of responsibility, can become a sentence passed down without appeal, and the family wanted to disappear into history, unnamed and unexamined. Instead, they became a case study, not of monstrosity, but of what happens when fear is allowed to outlive reason, when protection becomes possession, when love is confused with control. And perhaps the most unsettling truth of all is this: nothing about this story required malice to begin, only silence, only distance, only time. And what lingers after everything else has been documented is not the data, it's the absence, the empty spaces where childhoods should have been, the years that never had a chance to become memories because survival consumed everything. When historians look back at cases like this, they don't just see charts and diagnoses, they see erasures, lives narrowed so early that possibility never had room to exist, and the children who grew into adults outside the family carried something that no report could fully explain: a sense of being unfinished. Many described feeling older than their age and younger at the same time, old from carrying weight that wasn't theirs, young because so much development had been interrupted. They learned quickly that freedom doesn't arrive with instructions. It demands choices, and choices were something they had never practiced, and some tried to trace their lineage, hoping that understanding where it all began might loosen its grip. What they found instead was repetition, the same names, the same patterns, the same quiet decisions that redirected entire bloodlines. For some, this knowledge brought relief, proof that the damage wasn't personal failure. For others, it brought despair, because understanding didn't undo what had already been written into their bodies, and the community around them struggled too. Neighbors who had looked away were forced to confront their own silence. Teachers remembered children they'd worried about and wondered if they could have done more. Officials reviewed old files and saw missed chances stamped with dates years too early. Responsibility spread outward, uncomfortably, touching far more people than just one family. And this is the part of the story that rarely makes it into retellings: the realization that horrors like this don't survive on isolation alone. They survive on tolerance, on the quiet agreement not to interfere, on the belief that someone else will step in, or worse, that it's not our place to question what happens behind closed doors. And the family itself faded from public attention over time. News cycles moved on, new tragedies replaced old ones, but the consequences didn't fade, they settled. Some members lived under lifelong care, others drifted between jobs, relationships, and identities never fully anchored. A few disappeared entirely, choosing anonymity over explanation, and when historians speak of this case now, they do so carefully, not out of respect for the family name, but out of respect for the truth. That this wasn't a story of villains hiding in the woods. It was a story of ordinary people making decisions that felt necessary in the moment and catastrophic in the long run. A reminder that the most enduring horrors are rarely dramatic. They are procedural, incremental, rationalized, and there is a temptation to draw a distance between yourself and this story. To say this could never happen where you live, in your town, in your family. But distance is a comfort, not a guarantee. Every generation makes choices about what it will protect and what it will confront. Every family decides, in small ways, whether truth is welcome or dangerous. And the nightmare didn't end with exposure. It simply changed form. It lives on in bodies that will never function as they should, in minds that learned fear before language, in questions that arrive too late to change anything, and in archives that exist not to shame, but to warn. And because history is not just a record of what happened, it's a record of what was allowed. And if there is one lesson buried deepest beneath this story, it is this: silence is not neutral, isolation is not harmless, And when a society decides that some suffering is private, it quietly agrees to let it continue. And this is not a story meant to comfort you. It's meant to stay with you, to unsettle, to press gently but persistently against the idea that horror always announces itself loudly. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it smiles, sometimes it looks like tradition, and then sometimes it survives simply because no one wants to be the first to say, out loud, that something is wrong. And what remains, after the records are sealed and the experts move on, is the uncomfortable realization that this story never truly belonged to the family alone. It belonged to the spaces between them and everyone else. The long pauses where someone noticed something was wrong and chose not to press. The moments when discomfort outweighed responsibility. The years when silence felt easier than confrontation. And history likes clean endings, a rescue, a reckoning, a lesson learned. But this archive offers none of that. It leaves you standing in the aftermath, surrounded by facts that refuse to arrange themselves into comfort. Children who never had the chance to become anything else. Adults who inherited damage and passed it on without fully understanding how. A lineage shaped less by intention than by fear left unattended. And when future generations study cases like this, they won't ask how it became so extreme. That answer is already clear. They'll ask why it was allowed to last so long, why the signs were treated as curiosities instead of alarms, why isolation was mistaken for autonomy, and why family, a word meant to signal protection, was permitted to become a shield for harm. And the most unsettling part is not what was done, but how ordinary it all felt from the inside. No single decision seemed unforgivable at the time. Each one made sense in context. Each compromise felt temporary. Each silence felt justified. And that is how nightmares survive, not through grand evil, but through reasonable steps, taken one after another until there is no path back. And this story challenges a deeply American myth. That distance equals freedom. That privacy guarantees safety. That families left alone will naturally correct themselves. But blood does not self-correct. Trauma does not decay with time, and isolation does not purify. It concentrates, and the children born into this nightmare did not inherit evil. They inherited consequences. Consequences of fear, of mistrust, of a world narrowed so completely that choice disappeared, and once choice disappears, morality follows it out the door. What remains is survival without direction, continuity without care, and there is no moral satisfaction here, no villains unmasked, no redemption arc waiting just beyond the frame. Only the quiet understanding that history is shaped as much by what we refuse to see as by what we confront, and that some truths stay buried not because they are hidden well, but because they are too close to home, and the land where this happened still exists. Ordinary, unremarkable. Cars pass by without slowing. Children elsewhere are born without knowing this story ever unfolded beneath the same sky. And maybe that's the final horror. That a nightmare this deep can dissolve back into the background, leaving behind nothing but files, memories, and lives forever altered. And you were never meant to find this archive. Stories like this are supposed to remain fragmented, softened, explained away. But once seen, they change the way you look at families, at tradition, at silence itself. They force a question that doesn't belong to the past at all. And what are we allowing to continue right now, simply because stopping it would be uncomfortable? And because history is not finished. It is watching, recording, waiting to see which patterns repeat and which finally break. And the difference between those outcomes is rarely dramatic. It's a decision, made early, made quietly, made by someone who chooses to speak when silence would be easier. And this was not just a nightmare of blood. It was a nightmare of time, of years passing without intervention, of generations born into a story they never agreed to tell. And then once you've seen that, you don't leave unchanged.